Hi, and welcome to my podcast. My name's Ben King, and I'm a licensed therapist in Pennsylvania. And today we're going to be talking about setting boundaries. So it's something that tons of people struggle with throughout the year, but that struggle can come up much more often during the holidays. When you get a family together under the same roof, there can be a lot of differing opinions and views or ways of navigating through certain situations. And so today we're going to be exploring why setting boundaries can be a really great thing, why it's usually quite difficult to do, and some practical tips to be able to work through setting those boundaries. So first, what does it mean to set boundaries? Setting boundaries is the practice of openly communicating and asserting your personal values as a way to preserve and protect against having them compromised or violated. So metaphorically, it would be as if you drew a box around yourself in the sand at the beach and communicated to those around you that you'd like them to remain out of your personal space. Ideally, setting boundaries is really a great thing for many reasons. You feel empowered because you're making your personal values known. You feel respected and considered because other people respect those boundaries, and you don't feel overloaded because you didn't take on too much, among other benefits. Overall, it feels like having just more control in your day to day, not control in the tyrannical sense, but feeling free to move about your world in a way that instills confidence and peace. It can also rub off on other people. If they know exactly how you feel and what your boundaries are, they can interact with you with more confidence because they're just going to be much more clear on what is and what isn't okay with you. And so a big part of this is that setting boundaries is actually really difficult a lot of the time. Unfortunately, it usually doesn't look so smooth when we actually try to set boundaries. It's usually messy and creates negative reactions and just unpleasant emotions for everybody involved. Some of the most common reasons for why it's so difficult we'll get into right now. So the first one is that the other person is insulted or upset by you setting those boundaries. So for a lot of families or other systems, friendships, even intimate relationships, setting boundaries just doesn't happen. It's usually either blowing up at each other or holding our feelings in and being passive aggressive. And so in these families, setting boundaries isn't actually viewed as healthy. It's viewed as an insult or a slight against the other person. One of the most difficult parts of this dynamic is if one person is working on themselves and trying to create healthier dynamics, they might look at setting boundaries as a great idea that will make positive change. In theory, this works very smoothly, but in practice, their setting boundaries actually creates more conflict. And this can be really demoralizing for that person and actually keep us stuck in that unhealthy dynamic. And so another one, we're so used to there not being any boundaries. If we're not used to setting boundaries or others doing so, trying to start will usually be very unnatural and uncomfortable. Even if others around us are receptive to it, it's still not going to be easy. And it makes it so much harder if those around us are not receptive and act out against it. The more conflict that it creates, the more difficult it'll be to convince ourselves to keep trying to set that boundary instead of just giving up. And so a third part, we set the boundary in a harsh manner, another misstep. So I often see this when a person tries to set boundaries for the first time. They'll express them in a very harsh manner. And so in my view, this happens quite a lot because the idea of setting boundaries is misinterpreted. Instead of viewing it as a collaborative process with each other, it's viewed as giving the other person an order and expecting them to comply with that. Instead of trying to share with the other person my feelings and hopes for the future, I will, quote unquote, call them out and demand that they stop crossing that line. Now, is this understandable? Of course it is. You're doing something that makes me uncomfortable or hurts me, so I have to get you to respect my boundaries. However, the healthiest way to accomplish this is to do it collaboratively. It's also, in many cases, the most likely path for them to respect those boundaries. If they feel like we're being condescending or giving them an order, they're likely to just fight back. But if they feel like we're focusing on our feelings instead of blaming them, they might be more able to hear us out. Another difficulty, we're not clear about the boundary we're trying to set or not assertive enough. This is the other side of the spectrum from being too harsh. When we're not assertive enough, we risk not communicating the importance of the boundary, or we just don't give a clear enough picture of what we want to be different in the future. It's somewhat similar to be given a task at work. So if your manager explains it in depth to you, you're much more able to understand and move forward with that task. But if they only give you a brief general overview, there's a much higher chance of misinterpretation for what the end result should look like or why you're working on that project in the first place. And then the last one I'll get to is we feel guilty by setting boundaries. Another very common difficulty is feeling guilty. For us, it doesn't feel healthy while we're setting boundaries. It actually feels like we're doing something wrong. So this is, again, made much more difficult if the people around us that we're trying to set boundaries with are guilt tripping us. So what this does is that it just adds to the quote-unquote proof that we really are doing something wrong. Those who feel this way often come from families or relationships where this was the dynamic, that setting boundaries means you don't love the other person enough or that you're selfish, which both of those are very, they're rarely true. There are more reasons why setting boundaries can be difficult, but these are the most common that I've seen. For any one person, the most important part is really figuring out why it's difficult for you in particular. A helpful way to identify why it is tough is to imagine yourself setting those boundaries and trying to envision how that would feel in the moment or afterwards. Do you think that you would get a positive response from the other person but still feel guilty? Would you get a very negative response where things escalate? Or would the other person shut down and withdraw? So just to be able to think about the different possible outcomes and try to figure out why it might be difficult for you. All right, and so how to actually set boundaries. So we've talked about why it's difficult to do so. So what can you do that'll make it a little bit easier to set boundaries? So here are a few ideas to ideally make the process smoother and more likely to stick. I'd also recommend searching online if you have a particular fear or dynamic that you want help with so that it can just be more so curated to your experience. So first, expect it to be a tough process and that you'll have to set boundaries more than once. So having realistic expectations doesn't automatically make setting boundaries easy, but it can make the process feel less surprising. So for many people, they expect setting boundaries to be a smooth process and create more peace and harmony almost automatically. So if you go into it expecting that, and then you get a lot of pushback, that disparity will make you feel much more hopeless. But if you go into it expecting a more difficult process with hard feelings that you're going to have to work through, you at the very least won't be caught off guard and will hopefully be more equipped to deal with those situations internally. All right, and then second, figure out the exact boundary that you want to set. So before you try to have those conversations, sit down by yourself and really figure out what boundary you want to set and how you would want to communicate it. So try to pinpoint how you're impacted by the current dynamic, how you would want that to look differently in the future, and what both people can do to maintain that new, healthier dynamic. And then third, communicate that boundary out of the heat of the moment. So if you're in the midst of a boundary violation and are feeling emotionally unregulated, don't try to set that new boundary right then and there. You can certainly try to end that interaction and take some time apart, but it's usually a good idea to not even attempt setting a boundary then. This is due to both people just being much less able to communicate in an open, vulnerable way when we're unregulated. But then after you've had some time to cool down and reflect on what you would like to express, then it can be a good time to try. And then communicate in a clear and assertive way, but not harsh or condescending. So when you're thinking about your boundary, also spend a good amount of time thinking about how you want to express it, not just what you'll say. The how is very often more important than the actual words. So, for example, if I come to you and start the conversation in a calm way where I'm not blaming you, you're much more likely to be willing to hear me out and to listen, instead of coming to you with a harsh tone and blaming language. Now, this can be very difficult to do, especially when we feel like we're kind of the victim in the situation. But trying to communicate in a clear and assertive, but not harsh or condescending way can give us a much better chance of actually being heard and having that boundary respected. And then this is a tough one, but decide how you'll deal with those who continually cross your boundaries. Ideally, those that you set boundaries with will eventually work with you, But there are certainly situations where the other person continues to cross that boundary and not work collaboratively with you. The best thing that you can do in these situations is figure out how you want to deal with them. This answer will be very different from person to person, but having your own plan is the most important part. For some, they'll say that their best option is to cut those people out of their life. For others, they'll decide that keeping that relationship despite of the boundary crossing and difficult feelings that come up is best for them. This is completely up to you, but having a plan in your own head that you truly believe is the best option can make it a little bit easier to follow through with. And then lastly, be patient with yourself and process through your feelings of setting boundaries. One of the most helpful things that you can do, if not the most helpful, is to be patient with yourself and try to process through those feelings during that process. Usually the end goal is to set these boundaries so that our relationship can grow into a more healthy place. But unfortunately for many of us, this being a difficult process will lead us to give up on that goal. I'm not saying that this is inherently wrong or that you're bad for giving up, but being more patient with yourself can allow you to keep on track. And so, as I've said, setting boundaries is usually very difficult, but every situation is different. For some, the thought of setting them is much more difficult than actually doing so because they're readily accepted and respected. For others, there will be significant pushback and possibly the continual disrespect of those boundaries. How others respond is completely out of your control. Even if you communicate them in the most productive and healthy way, they just might not be accepted. That's a big reason why it's so intimidating to do this. So for any of you who are already struggling with this or are going to try to set your boundaries, best of luck to you, and I hope it goes as smoothly as possible. If you need additional support, it can be a great idea to work with a therapist on this topic to figure out how you want to navigate through setting boundaries or just to cope with the difficult feelings that come up from doing so. So feel free to send me a message if you have any further questions or topics you'd like me to have an episode on. And if you're enjoying these episodes, you can like, follow, and subscribe to the podcast. Thank you for listening and have a great rest of your day. I'll talk to you all next time.